Well, I'm delighted to be joining you all here. I'm on unceded Shasta lands, and it's great to be connecting with you to explore what your hearts know about the future and what's needed to get there. And so this aspect of the body is so interesting to me. I think that our bodies hold so much wisdom in this space. And so we're going to begin with an exercise. If you grab a piece of paper and a pen, and if you don't have either of those, just in the spirit of cooperativism, maybe ask for someone to share. Those just joining the room will just need a pen and a paper.
I can just imagine it.
I need to finish up. I need to go through that.
And if you're needing a pen or something, just put your hand up so someone can help out with that. Thank you so much. All right. So what I'd like you to do is draw a line down the center of your page. And in the top right, write the word future. And in the top left of your page, write the word present. So a line down the center, top right, future, top left, present. And we're going to start on the right-hand side here. I'd like you to imagine a future that's working for everyone, all species, people and planet, non-human species, an economy that's working for everyone. Just imagine it for a moment. Don't need to do anything yet with your pen. Just imagine that future. And when you've connected with the imagination, drop your chin and drop into your body and feel it. What does it feel like in that economy of the future? And when you've connected with the feeling, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels in that future economy. Draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents how it feels in that future that's working for everyone and everything. Okay. And now we move over to the left-hand side of your page. How does the present economy feel? Connect with that feeling. And then draw a symbol or a shape that represents how the present economy feels without lifting your pen. Okay. I'm going to try some. I haven't shared a presentation before, so I'm going to try to do this and see if it works. Okay. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. So I've been doing this experiment for 8 years all around the world, across every demographic that I can imagine, actually. Gender, race, religious background, age, cultural heritage, wealth. I've done this across the ideological spectrum in countries all throughout the world. And every time I do this, people consistently draw the same 4 things for the future and the same 4 things for the present, or a combination of them, or a close variation. So here are the results, and you can see how this lines up with your experience. For the future, people typically draw a circle, an infinity symbol, a spiral, or a heart. So I can't see you so easily right now, but I'm going to ask you to just hold up your hand if you drew something that was one of those, a combination or something very close to those, and just have a look around. I can't quite see you, but we'll just leave that as it is. For the present, people either draw a jagged line, a triangle, sometimes a square, or like a cityscape sort of line instead of a triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines. Again, hold up your hand if you drew one of those, or a close variation of those. Okay. I'm going to actually, because you're all in the space and I don't think we've got anyone tuning in virtually, and let me just check if that is the case. I think we have some people virtually. So I was going to say turn to each other and have the conversation, but instead what I'll get you to do is imagine you're having a conversation with someone right now, and just take 30 seconds to just reflect on what you notice in this experiment, both in terms of what you drew and what's here in terms of the common drawings for the future and the present. Just take 30 seconds in silence to just notice that. Would anyone in the audience, and I'm sorry, I can only see the in-person audience a little, would anyone like more time to reflect? Just put your hand up if you would. Okay. And is there anyone who'd like to share a reflection on something they notice here? And I'll do my best to hear you. And if you're on the live stream here and you'd like to speak as well, I don't know how this works, so maybe you can just come off mute. But let's see if there's up to 3 people, maybe across the different mediums, the in-person and the virtual, who'd like to share an observation. I'll need you to sort of self-moderate, given I can't see much at the moment. So who'd like to share something first?
I can just go and just say something.
No matter what intersectional background you have, we all want the same thing, and we're all stuck in the same present.
Thank you for sharing that. That's been my observation, absolutely, yeah. Someone else?
I guess the comparisons in between the two for future and present in terms of the symbolism is it's smooth for the future, very smooth kind of continual motions, whereas for present it's very jarring and jagged shapes. Kind of, I think, to me resonated like feeling very like jarred, and it's very abrupt and very like harsh, I guess.
Right. Thank you for making that observation. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Is there a third person and maybe someone online? I don't know if you're able to unmute, and if not, we'll go back to the audience. Okay, maybe someone from the in-person audience.
I was just going to build on what Asha said in terms of it being the future is united and connected and whole. It is circular. It is connected as opposed to separate and going different directions.
Yeah, that's such a great observation as well. The connection piece, the closed loop aspect of it in a way. The thing that strikes me is that the top line here around the future is non-linear, and the bottom one is linear. And nature doesn't do straight lines. Right, like, so to the second person who shared's point, isn't it fascinating that across forms of intersectionality there's commonality? I put that down to just an affirmation of what wisdom really is. It's when we tap into what we know that is universal. And as I said in the panel there, this knowing that all living systems thrive on circulation and they die when that circulation isn't present, just like when oxygen and blood doesn't circulate through our body, we get necrosis, just like what's happening with our climate right now. And I mean, the bottom is very artificial as well, right? Like, given the future images here are non-linear, and as someone said, there's a connection there, and there's relationship as well. There's a different form of relationship, but the bottom is very artificial. It's very anthropocentric in many ways, and so to me this is incredible news, because what it means is that, for me anyway, the majority of people in my sphere spend hours and weeks and months and years and decades trying to convince people of their argument for why we need a different system. And it only takes a few seconds of dropping into our bodies to be able to say, you already have that answer, and now let's unpack what's not circulating. I don't need to convince you about the need for a systems change because you drew it. I've done this experiment with wealthy billionaires, and they draw the same things you drew. And then we work backwards and say, okay, what's not circulating? And I'm going to share a little about what I think's at the core there in just a moment. And they ultimately get to the same pieces that I got to over 10 years of concerted deep dives into central banking, fractional reserve systems, compounding interest, currency exchange, et cetera, et cetera. They get to the same conclusion in just a few minutes. I'm a professor of economics, an honorary professor of economics at a small university here, and I've never once been in an economics class in my life. I've never taken an economics class. I have no training in economics. And I think that's been a real benefit in the space, because I'm interested in embodied practice. I'm interested in dropping down from the head and actually feeling things as a proactive counter response to a patriarchal system that essentially privileges analytical, so-called rational, head-based, disconnected thought, which is, in a way, the economics profession writ large. So to me, there's just so much richness, even in just these diagrams. I've facilitated sessions where we just stop here, and then there's just a conversation that emerges with the two people turning to each other and talking, and then it just burgeons from there, and people come to the same conclusions that I'm ultimately going to share in just a moment. So maybe one thing I encourage you to do is go and try this experiment with others as a gateway to a conversation, if you're interested in having a different kind of conversation or exploration with people, from the starting point that chances are they're going to reconnect, especially if you say without lifting your pen. That's an important point of the methodology. Otherwise, people often stay in the imaginary and draw like a scenery, with flowers and although it still typically follows the linear non-linear differentiation. But so I want to move forward though here in terms of what isn't circulating. And let me see if I can. For me, there's sort of layers of importance here, having looked at this for a long time, and sort of the outer layer with respect to the economy is this circulation of resources. Some of you may have heard the term circular economy, and there's a lot of attention on this right now, like especially the recycling and reuse spaces. I'm sure many of you recycle and have been involved in repurposing items and seen businesses really try to present a lot of their emerging credentials with respect to how much of their business is so-called circular, which for those interested, the latest study on the global economy is that 8.6% of the global economy is circular. In other words, most of our economy just has throughput where things just go straight through to waste, single use, etc., straight through to waste. So this is really the outer part of the ring, because you can change all you want with respect to recycling or reusing, but it doesn't address fundamental consumption. And within that second ring, it's not consumption though that I think is the next round. It's power. There's so many people doing great work on seeking to democratize power within societies, within workplaces, within families. And yet it's still, in my assessment, not at the core of our economic challenges, the accumulation of power. A lot of people point to that when they say, you know, certain people have a lot of power and there's a lot of privilege associated with that accumulation of power. The correlation there is strong. But for me, having looked at this for over a decade, in fact, it ends up being the circulation of money that is what needs to circulate the most. Not wealth accumulation, actually, not wealth inequity, which is a common term you would have, you encounter a lot. It's not wealth inequality that's the problem, it's monetary inequality. And there's a difference there that's actually fundamental, as we'll explore in just a moment here. But when money circulates, you see a loosening up of power. There's a correlation with the circulation of power, and there's an absolute correlation with the circulation of resources, such that you open up the space when money circulates for communities of enough. I'm thinking here about a story I heard many years ago that later on I discovered was the practice of the potlatch in the Pacific Northwest here among Indigenous communities through to the lands to the north of me, where in cultures, Indigenous cultures, there is a practice that when someone reaches a certain level of so-called accumulated wealth, that they will put on a feast for the rest of their village until they become the so-called poorest, and then have a mark, put on their forehead or, in some kind of historic recording of this to recognize that process. Like it was inbuilt, this understanding of the need for things to circulate with respect to money or the equivalence of money in cultures that are perhaps not using money as we know it as their means for exchange. And so why is it that money in our global capitalist system is so crucial? And I spoke a little about this in the panel session. It's because that the challenge we're really facing is that in any capitalist system, the siphon, the way that money gets taken out of common circulation, is stronger than the funnel. What do I mean by that? I mean that the way that the elite economy, and I'm going to separate it out and I'm going to call it the elite economy and the real economy, the real economy being where the majority of labor occurs, and the elite economy that often lives in a disconnected, kind of fictitious world, especially with respect to investments that are often, investments in abstractions like derivatives and those sorts of instruments. The siphoning that happens from their capital gains, from their investments and sometimes subsidies that they get, and even wages, right? If you are working as a big CEO of a big company, then that can contribute to the siphoning of money out of real economy. That siphon is always stronger than the amount of wages, taxes, welfare, subsidies, scholarships, etc., you can read it yourself, the amount that goes back in. And this is really, really important, because 15 years ago when I was working on this kind of stuff, I remember like, I'm gonna tell a short personal story. I remember being at an event. I grew up listening to the Oils and really appreciating the lyrics and the sentiment behind Midnight Oil's work. And I remember I started my work in this sphere about maybe 18 years ago, And I went along to an event, maybe it was 15 years ago. Peter Garrett had been elected, and he was the federal, I think, environmental minister at the time. And I went and I asked him a question about ecological limits and monetary accumulation. And I think it was a pretty straightforward question. Like, I wasn't getting too much into the weeds. And I remember his response was just, you know, we can regulate our way out of it. We just need more, you know, a more fair sharing. You know, these sorts of things. The funnel was his response, along with innovation as sort of the way we can get out of this dilemma. And I mean, I didn't take it too personally, in the sense that I think that lots of people who have been in the environmental advocacy space often haven't really questioned some underpinning assumptions with respect to, like, okay, well, what would an economy look like that actually was ecologically, socially just, etc. But it doesn't take really that much, other than going, okay, am I open to actually having my assumptions, my core assumptions, or the basis on which I've built my life or my family wealth, if you're in a position of privilege, etc., questioned, to actually say, hold on a second, if we just look at this and we say, all right, so money goes over here and it doesn't go back nearly as fast. And as I said in the panel session, if it did, if the amount of wages that you paid out as an owner of a business, or you know, a business that you were invested in paid out, or the amount of taxes your company paid, or the amount you paid personally, or the amount of scholarships you offered, or donations you made, etc., was as much as the money that you are accumulating, then it wouldn't be capitalism. There'd be no incentive for people to invest under a capitalist ideology, or to start a business themselves. So the very piece in this is that capital accumulates, and this is a really important piece. The free market system speeds that up, right? So when you don't have a lot of regulation, the accumulation speeds up. But, and this is the crucial bit, a regulated economy, so think here traditional sort of leftist economics, just hides it better, right? This is the important bit. The free market approach speeds up the accumulation, but the regulated capitalist approach hides the accumulation better. So, oh, let's have a, you know, let's redistribute wealth, let's increase taxes on the rich, let's have a global billionaires tax, let's increase wages, you know, let's fight for increasing the minimum wage, let's increase the welfare state, let's increase subsidies to people that are in need, etc. None of it, it's all window dressing if you're not fundamentally addressing the siphon, right? And this is just so interesting, because this is the point at which I see lots of people, if we haven't gone through the drawing exercise, will start bending over backwards to justify why this is bullshit. You know, and they'll start going on about maybe some inflation or GDP stuff or job creation. And at the end of the day, it's just a mathematical simplicity. Show me how the money is going to circulate more than it's going to accumulate. And then show me the data that suggests that hasn't been happening for the last 100 years. And the problem with that is, as I mentioned in the panel, is that when money accumulates in the banks of the wealthiest individuals, businesses, and governments, very little governments to be honest, so mostly businesses and households, and often in offshore bank accounts, the debt has to accumulate elsewhere. And again, I'd rather not go into this in this presentation in terms of wanting to get to conversation here. I could explain that if it's helpful to really go through the steps involved of how money enters the system and separates out. But it essentially comes back to, as Bob Costanza was saying, the majority of money gets created when you take out a loan from a bank, and the bank creates new money. And then all of a sudden you have a debt, but you've also got money in your bank account that you then use to purchase whatever it is that you were getting the loan for. And at that point, the money separates from the debt, right? You keep the debt, you get an asset that underpins it, but the money goes to someone that you purchased it from. The only way for your debt to disappear from the system, that this new debt that got created, is if money comes back around in equal amount plus more because of interest to wipe out that debt. And because you have a splitting in a capitalist system between money accumulation or because you have monetary accumulation in a capitalist system, there's this debt that's left out here that can't be wiped out. No amount of so-called poor people working harder and getting more jobs can address the debt issue of households that are underwater in our global economy. We can offshore it. If you're living in Australia, or if you're living here in the US, you can do what's happened both in colonial times and neo-colonial times, which is to export that debt and to exploit labor in other parts of the world. But in aggregate, there's no mathematical way for this to reduce. I mean, this is, and this explains why we actually feel like the jagged line is there, even though some people are trying to tell us that we've never had it better than ever. People write books about how, crime overall is lower, wars are lower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't line up with what we're actually feeling, because underneath it all, there's more strain, and it's often invisible. So what your heart knows is that the circulation has to be greater than the accumulation. And the test that I have here that I encourage you to think about is anything that you're engaging with, and this is the same for power and resources. Does an activity, policy, or approach increase the overall circulation of money, power, and resources, including the natural cycle of things within the environment, without simultaneously reinforcing the overall accumulation of any of these things? Because there's tons of environmentally oriented organizations, big for-profit companies, the Unilevers of the world, that will say, we are doing all these amazing things to slow down resource throughput through our system. Look at the way we're doing the repurposing of this, or look at the way we're allowing you to bring back in your bottle for this, or et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, that company, if it's profitable, is contributing to the overall accumulation of money, right? Which creates then downward. You've got the debt accumulation and the asset accumulation, the monetary accumulation split. And so in that system, you get a bunch of extremely wealthy individuals and companies that set the agenda for status envy. They get to call the shots on an ongoing accumulatory system. Consume more, while they're telling you we're doing things in a way which is better for the environment. I mean, it's just bullshit. It's a smoke screen. The exciting thing about this, as I was saying earlier, is we know this, and not like the more we actually give people a chance to connect with their feelings, the more we can reveal this diagnosis and then talk to that in people. But also that the two largest untold stories I'm familiar with in the last 100 years of history really are that under capitalism, debt always expanded, and that the forms of business that circulate money are an incredibly large, almost 20% contributor to global GDP. And that for every single model of any kind of business you would want to have in the future as part of a market economy, there exists a not-for-profit form of that business. There exists an example of that business being driven purely by purpose without some individual or shareholders or partnership of individuals seeking to profit maximize through that activity. And that's really, really exciting and inspiring. And that's the topic of what is often a 1 or 2 hour conversation exploration of that model. My colleague Jennifer Hinton and I mapped what a system would look like if we accelerated the growing trend, it's a trend, and this is the incredible news. There is a shift in business competitiveness that is heading towards businesses that circulate money, power, and resources. Those kinds of businesses in the world are increasingly outcompeting the businesses that accumulate. They outcompete with respect to worker motivation. They outcompete with respect to innovation. They outcompete financially because they don't have to pay shareholders dividends, so they've got extra profits to work with. Some of you may know that IKEA is a not-for-profit business. It's a foundation-owned business, and it gets some really strange coverage in the Australian media because people think that, including good journalists, to be honest, they often say, "Oh, IKEA is avoiding taxes, right? It doesn't pay taxes in Australia." Do you know why IKEA doesn't pay taxes in Australia, business taxes? Because it's a not-for-profit. It doesn't have private individual owners. It's a franchise system that exists under a not-for-profit structure. And I think there's actually there's a member from the IKEA team at this conference I noticed from their sustainability team. And I believe I was with her a few years ago. I was sitting next to 3 leaders of sustainability in IKEA. And of course, we could go into the conversation about IKEA and growth and consumption and what it's driving on that front. And trust me, that's a conversation I love having. But I want to just come back to this monetary piece, remembering the target and the money piece being at the center. I asked the folks at IKEA who didn't know me or my background or my passion for not-for-profit business, I said, what benefit, if anything, or what's it like? You all worked at for-profits before IKEA, and they all said yes. I said, what's it like working at a not-for-profit or a foundation-owned business with respect to sustainability? And they all almost unanimously, in unison almost said, it's so much easier. We come in and we start talking about sustainability without shareholders looming over us. We don't serve shareholders. We're a purpose-driven business where all of the profits go back into the organization, and some of them go over to the IKEA Foundation, which is working in a range of different social sector service provision areas. That's an example of just how big a company can be that's circulating profit and money within a system. And there's very little accumulation of money that happens through IKEA as a business model. And that macro effect is so much more important than talking about what's actually happening with products, even though I think IKEA is leading in that space with respect to the circular economy as well. So again, there's a whole model that I could go into here, and just one thing I'll say is that when Jennifer Hinton and I modeled what would happen if these trends continue, and we actually saw a post-capitalist system emerge where for-profit businesses just couldn't compete against not-for-profit equivalents, and that every business, every bank, every bakery, every manufacturing business was a not-for-profit. What we found was incredible. Every single thing that's wrong with our that's wrong and critiqued by a lot of the left in our economic system. So, fractional reserve banking, compound interest, money itself, debt, advertising, the corporation and corporate personhood, limited liability, all of these things actually flip positive. When money circulates, all of those things become really importantly good. And I could explain why if ever interested. So I disagree with Bob Costanza's assessment before about there being a problem with fractional reserve banking. No, there's a problem with our economic system, which is capitalism. It accumulates money. Fractional reserve is a fantastic system that allows for liquidity in a system, and I'm going into some technical detail there again, but just to highlight, we've been misdiagnosing, a lot of us, especially in the economic space, misdiagnosing the challenge. It's fundamentally what you already know. It's about circulation versus accumulation. And what can you do about it? There's 5 things in my work that I found are the most powerful leverage points that I can come up with. The first is to move your money. And I mean, whatever that means to you, it might be, move your money to an ethical bank. And that could mean different things to you. For me in the US, it's the credit union system. Credit unions in the US are all not-for-profit, and this is an encouraging statistic. There's over 122 million members of credit unions in the US. Over 122 million people out of about 260 million who are financially active. So it's in fact, it's over 50% now. I think it's 52% of the US population banks with a credit union, a not-for-profit bank, member-owned. The reason that moving your money is so powerful, though, is, and I often hear, I'm in talks with students who say, I've just got $10 in my bank, or, I don't have any money in my bank account. But even if you have $10, the way that fractional reserve works, where the bank can lend out more than it has in deposits, means that if you move 10 Australian dollars from one bank to another, you end up moving a factor of, it's different across different countries, but probably somewhere I'm guessing around a factor of 15. So you end up moving about $150 worth of money in Australia is my guess when you move $10, because then the bank that you moved it to can suddenly lend out 7 times more, and the bank that you previously had it in can no longer do that. So moving your money is an incredibly powerful way to stifle the for-profit banks that you might be banking with, if you're with one, and actually move liquidity over into banks that circulate money. Likewise, moving your investments. I remember years ago I was with UniSuper, and I remember I said I wanted a zero growth option, and they said we don't have it, sorry. And so I just ended up taking, and it's not easy, but during COVID I took all of my money out of Super, which was $3,500. I didn't have much in there, relatively speaking, and I just put that into things in my local economy, just buying from local organizations and paying off debts, including like helping friends out to pay off their debts. Like, that's just a personal story of that. But looking at what are some of the more ethical super options or investment options that you have, and realizing that most investment is not actually an in. There's no in most of the investment stuff. You're not actually putting money into companies like used to happen 20, 30 years ago. You're not actually creating something new in most forms of your investment, if you've got any, especially if you've got someone managing your funds, and it might be superannuation and the like. What they're doing is they're just trading money with someone else who's got a certificate for a share somewhere, and there's no money actually going in, no productive input into the economy through your investments. Why? Because the productive investment happened when a company was founded, or before it went to market, or before it had an IPO. So in other words, most people think they're investing, or they use the language of investing, but you're not actually adding anything into the system. You're not giving your money to something that's actually helping to fund jobs or the like. You're just buying a share from some other nameless person somewhere else in the world and trading money in a speculative form of gambling, really. So finding ways to move your investments locally, supporting debt mechanisms of looking to see whether you can lend through your bank or through other forms of investment to not-for-profit forms of business or social enterprise. There's a lot of impact investment that gets close to that. Anything you do to move your investments in a more ethical direction is going to help. Moving your labor, actually shifting over and working for a business that circulates profits. And that's, a privileged thing for me to say, perhaps. It's not possible for all sorts of people to move their labor, and probably many of you in this room actually work for not-for-profit forms of business. Maybe you work in the education sector or the healthcare sector, or for a not-for-profit, for example. And in that sense, I would always say, and there's a danger of what I'm about to say sounding like corporatization, but an incredible story that's happened over the last 30 years that the Johns Hopkins University has, the Center for Civil Society has really documented, is that nonprofits went into business. Nonprofits, like traditional nonprofits, over the last 30 years went into business. And it was because it got so precarious with, philanthropy from wealthy donors or governments being pulled out as soon as there was a change in the winds of fortune. And so around the world, the majority of nonprofit income for all nonprofits across all sectors, and this is in studies that includes countries from Kazakhstan, the Philippines, through to the US, the majority of nonprofit income these days is actually from revenue self-generated. And less than 20% of nonprofit revenue across all sectors is coming from philanthropy and grants. So moving over to these emerging businesses that have a purpose at their heart, that are driven by purpose, and then use money and profits as a way to continue their purpose, and seeking to democratize those workplaces and change the power dynamics within them, is such a powerful piece in this equation. And there's a lot, we're seeing a lot of areas where previously not-for-profits were priced out in terms of, really certain certain individuals in the labour market just going to wherever the money was. And now we're seeing with the Great Resignation, so many people saying, I'll take a pay cut. I'm not working for that kind of extractive company anymore. It doesn't matter how much debt I'm in, how much trouble I'm in. I'm going to find meaning and purpose in my work. And I think that's a powerful effect on the market. The last two here are just to think about this lens of like accumulation versus circulation, to think, where is power accumulating? Where's money accumulating? And can I make a differentiation, or can I ask questions? Hey, are you privately owned? You know, are you owned by private individuals? Do you have shareholders? Oh, okay, I didn't realize. I thought you were a cooperative. How come you use cooperative in the, you know, like just asking, probing. And lastly, moving your advocacy, supporting these kinds of initiatives, entities that are focused on circulating money, power, and resources, particularly the money and power piece. The more we put our attention and advocacy in these spaces, the more we get things like, as I mentioned in the panel, business.gov, including cooperatives and mutuals on their front page as a legitimate form of business alongside other for-profit forms. That kind of stuff really makes a difference, because the greatest thing I've noticed in my work all around the world is that most people, when you explore with them what kind of future they want, just don't know how to get there. They don't know what the steps would be to actually move us to a system. And I'll end here with Andrew White's research in this space. He was doing work with the Said Business School at Oxford with senior leaders from the corporate elites of the world, you know, the Fortune 500. And he would do these 2-hour long interviews where he would keep saying, but that doesn't seem sustainable, what you're saying. And then they'd come up with some more bullshit reason for what it was, why it was sustainable. And then he'd say, but that doesn't sound sustainable. And he said that something interesting happened at around the 2-hour mark with almost everyone. These largely male corporate executives would just start crying. And they'd say, you're right, it's not sustainable, but what's the alternative? So this is like, no one's put forward a sustainable alternative beyond capitalism that I'm aware of. I mean, it's what we work on with this not-for-profit world model. But we've been lacking like a dedicated critique that analyzed what was central to this. And it's not just capitalism, I should say. I just think that capitalism is such a centrally problematic system that until you get to that conversation and say, okay, we're all on the same page that we need to move beyond capitalism, it's hard to actually be making differences because you're often just participating in problems within the system in ways that you don't realize. But I'll end with another brief story and then move over to questions for the time that we have left here. And I see we're at the hour. So in fact, I'll move over to questions and comments now and perhaps end with a story to close us out. So thank you, everyone. I'll encourage you to just take a few moments of silence to reflect, especially for those with more introverted tendencies, to just have a chance to gather your thoughts before we move into questions and comments, especially given extroverts like myself so easily dominate those sessions by jumping straight in with my question or comment. So just take 30 seconds of silent reflection, and then I'll see if we can sort of self-moderate some comments and questions. All right. Again, I can't see anyone in the online audience, so I'm so sorry if you're putting hands up or having things you'd like to share. I'm just going to ask for anyone in the audience to help self-moderate here, and I see someone in the back left there has their hand up. Yes.
That's me. I have a question. How can we reconcile social entrepreneurship with expanding the fund? Because you were talking mostly about, not for profits, but for example, for somebody like me who's a student who's hoping to start a social enterprise. Your talk was both confronting and inspirational. just to let you know. So how do we reconcile that? Just any thoughts?
Thank you so much. I missed the word you said after. How do we reconcile social enterprise with, and then I didn't hear the next bit.
Okay, with expanding the funnel in what you were talking about earlier.
Expanding the
funnel.
Funnel.
Oh, the funnel. Oh, thank you. I thought you said expanding the fun. I'm like, oh, I'm all about expanding the fun. So I think with fear of I hope I'm not going to be repeating myself here too much. My apologies. The social enterprise space around the world, like if you look at particular at some of the people who've been so influential in that space, like Muhammad Yunus, for example, right? You'll see that they often don't differentiate between for-profit and not-for-profit forms of social enterprise. But then you look at one of the world's most incredible examples of social enterprise that I know of. In fact, I would say hands down the most successful scaling social enterprise that I've ever encountered, from Bangladesh as well. And most people think Grameen Bank, which is the Yunus model. The most successful model that I know of in the world right now for social enterprise is BRAC. And it was started in 1972, Sir Faisal Abed, and it is an organization that serves with almost $1 billion revenue budget, serves tens of millions of people in social, healthcare sectors, education, finance, etc. They do microfinance as well. 120,000 employees, mainly women, working across 10 countries. And it's not for profit. And the vast majority, over 80% of BRAC's revenue, comes from businesses that it runs. And it runs businesses in high tech all the way through to craft stores and bakeries. That model of social enterprise and the distinguishing feature that it is not owned by any private individual is a story that is not being told. And this delineation between for-profit and not-for-profit, you don't see it in many spheres. You definitely don't see it in the cooperative sphere. There's very little differentiation between consumer cooperatives, which are always not-for-profit, and producer cooperatives. So you see like cooperatives getting bundled in like big wheat cooperatives, for example, in Western Australia, thrown in the same bundle as a small artists cooperative, or a childcare cooperative, or I'm thinking of like the co-op bookstore, even though it's no longer existing, or the what are they called, like the NRMA in New South Wales, right? Those kind of things. Those member-owned businesses that are not for profit, they all get bundled in together. Very few people make the distinction, and the distinction is what drives either accumulation or circulation. It's not wage differences, which gets a lot of attention. That's actually the problem. It's what happens behind the scene where profits get extracted into the hands of shareholders. That's what drives inequality in the world, fundamentally. So to maybe poorly, I'm sorry, answer your question if I understood it, it's that the more we introduce people to there being different models outside of for-profit social enterprise, and the sticking point usually is capital. How do you raise money to start a social enterprise? And again, because of a failure of imagination, in my opinion, most people don't realize there are tons of ways you can raise money as a not-for-profit. There are debt mechanisms. You can even use things called revenue-based finance. You can use bonds. Like, I'll just give an example just to sort of highlight this thing of why people go, oh, I went down and I started a for-profit social enterprise, is because people are thinking, I can't raise the money I need to get my business started. Well, take the Welsh water system. About 20 years ago, it was privatized and a US company took over, and it was disastrous for the Welsh people. A bunch of people got together about 15 years ago and said, let's take it back. Let's set up a not-for-profit and buy out the Welsh water system. How the heck are you going to do that? Well, they raised over 5 billion Australian dollars by floating a bond on the European bond market that they're now in the process of paying off, and they took the water system not for profit. That's not a government takeover. That's a bunch of 3 people who said, let's take it back. So there's just a loss of imagination that when you flip it and you open it up and you say, there's nothing you can't do under a not-for-profit structure in this world. And that means that you're all going to be driven by purpose. No one's getting rich out of a not-for-profit business that I know of, other than some of the health insurance companies in the US. But even then, the level of inequality that they create is minimal compared to what happens with the extraction. So thinking of not-for-profit ways to be a social entrepreneur, which is really what social entrepreneurship was fundamentally about, right? Bringing purpose to the center. And then it got washed out because people said, oh, you can have your cake and eat it too. The Richard Bransons of the world say we can people, planet, profit. And what they mean is people, planet, and private profit. And that's where there's just a fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem. You can't have people, planet, private profit. You need people, planet, not for profit.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I don't know, I know we started a little over time. I'm here. It's almost 9 o'clock at night, but I'm going strong. I don't have coffee, but I'm here with you. So happy to keep going for as long as is smart for you, the next part of your schedule. So yes, I think there's someone in the center with a hand up.
I'm very interested on your mapping. Is that available on your website? Is the work that you've done around the mapping, the future ecosystem, available or visible or readable somewhere?
Yes, we have a, if you go to howonearth.us, you can see the draft copy of our book that outlines some of this. But actually, we haven't published the majority of it yet. We're just trying to live the actual organizational ethics internally, which means that we move in a way that it's a little slower in some senses. We focus on relationships within our organization, and we're building out hopefully a movement with our ecosystem partners. And so I haven't got to the research publishing as much as we would have liked. But the Johns Hopkins University data is particularly impressive. If you look to the work of Lester Salomon, Salamon, and his team on what happened in the nonprofit sector around the world, it's mind-blowing. And this story for me, just so you know, started with a community development conference in 2009 in Brisbane, where a guy gets up as the keynote. He runs an Indigenous corporation called Mayuma, and he says, I run a 50-person, $17 million turnover civil construction business up here in Queensland, in remote parts of Queensland, and we're not for profit. I was like, what? And I went up to him afterwards. He said, yeah, us Indigenous mob, we ain't going to be taking money out of this business. We pooled some funds to begin with, put some money in, took that back out, as like a loan into the fund once it got started. And of course, we're going to run it not for profit. So that opened up my understanding. And then I realized I'd been working for not-for-profit businesses all the way through, from Lifeline to the Fred Hollows Foundation with their lens factories in Eritrea and Nepal, to St. Vincent de Paul, that you'd know about their shops and things like that. And I realized that this was a model that was unspoken in terms of defining it as a not-for-profit business. And then I looked everywhere, and Jen and Hinton and I found that in every single sector across pretty much every single country in the world, there were not-for-profit forms of business that existed. They just weren't calling themselves that. But when you looked at their legal structure, you realized they were like that. So I'd encourage looking at Lester Salomon and his team's work.
There's just a question out the back.
I'm interested. The large not-for-profits you're talking about, is there an index somewhere that I can actually look at that to look at these companies and and do a bit of research on them?
Yeah, great question. That's another piece of data that we haven't published yet. I'm so sorry. we have it, but you can. One way that you could look, for example, and get some pretty interesting information is if you type in world's largest consumer cooperatives, or even the world's largest cooperatives, and you'll see that most of the forms there, especially mutual insurance companies, are all not-for-profit. Around the world, most credit unions in the world are not-for-profit. Public banks are not-for-profit. One of the reasons that certain countries in 2008 didn't get hit by the financial crisis in the way that others like Australia did was because they had public banks, government-owned banks that aren't like the private banks in terms of the extraction. They actually counter-cyclically lend, although that's starting to happen a little more as well as post-Keynesian economics sort of rolls out in a COVID world. But there are those examples. You can just type in consumer cooperatives, largest consumer cooperatives, and you'll see a ton of incredible companies that exist under a not-for-profit structure. I mean, AMP used to be a not-for-profit, for those who are old enough to remember AMP. A strange one that people are surprised by is that for 7 years, the Ford Motor Company, was not for profit. Ford actually tried to convince his family members to put their money their shares over into a foundation, and he successfully did that back in I think it was the 20s. And Ford has a long history of anti-Semitism and things that are very problematic. But putting that to aside just for a moment, he convinced his family members to shift their money over because he wanted his employees to be able to afford the cars they were making. So his idea was to not extract profits, but to pay better wages. And the Dodge brothers blocked him. And it's actually where the for-profit legislation and why this notion of a company's purpose being to maximize profit actually comes from the very ruling about that case, because the Dodge brothers successfully blocked that practice by a ruling that said, no, that's not legal to just force people to shift their money over to a foundation. So he had to wait 15 years, and then Dodge brothers got out, and then his family shifted all their money over, and it became the Ford Foundation, which fully owned the Ford Motor Company for 7 years before they sold off some of their shares and it went fully private on the market. So, not many people know about these kinds of models, or that there were historical evidence or examples like that.
Next session is
So I think the next session starting, I'm going to just end with a very brief story because we got there into some of the detail, and I just want to remind us that it's in our hearts and in our bodies where there's so much here that's worth taking. So the very short story is that Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22, was at a event with a private venture capital folks out on Skelter Island off the east coast of the US. And his friend comes up to him and said, "Hey, Joseph, does it matter to you that this guy, our friend here, is going to make more money in one day than you'll probably make in the whole life of your book sales?" And Joe turns to his friend and says, "It doesn't bother me." And his friend says, "How come?" And Joe turns to him and says, "Because I've got something that he'll never have." His friend says, "What's that?" And he said, "Enough." Here's to an economics of enough. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.